Hello and welcome to another guide for Divide Et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be covering the Arverni, who are a pretty well-rounded Celtic faction in general. They have great spearmen, superior swordsmen, some limited but excellent cavalry options, and of course, infamously powerful Celtic slingers. Yes, they don't have the most powerful unit in any of those categories, but they do have generally solid options. For the jack of all trades, the Swiss army knife when it comes to Celtic factions. So let's go check out their start position and figure out how to make this beastly faction into an empire. Alright guys, so this is the start position for the Arverni, and right from the onset what you can say is that you're a relatively wealthy early game faction. You don't have vast populations in your one settlement here in Nemoses, but you do start out with gold, which is, I'm sure unsurprisingly, one of the most valuable resources in the game. On turn 1, it won't give you like amazing income. You can see only 200 wealth for manufacturing in this settlement, but as you upgrade the settlement, it'll give you significantly more money than the vast majority of settlement buildings as well as just other improvements. They give you a plus 2% tax rate for all provinces, which is crazy, a buff to all the desirable classes that you want to recruit from. Of course, one of the most valuable trading resources in gold, and plus 8% wealth from all commerce. I mean, like, literally, this is one of the best buildings you could possibly have in the game, and you have it from turn 1, which is a humongous advantage for the Arverni, and one of the big advantages that you have in early game. But outside of this, you don't really have a ton going from you right away. Like, for one, your settlement isn't particularly well populated. 25,000 men is very average to below average when it comes to an early game population. You do have at least access to quite a few of your second class citizens, which you will mostly use to recruit your better units in your army, so it is of course valuable when you have them, but it's not like you have like a crazy number either. But 3,000 is a nice and comfortable number. Your turn 1 recruitment is horrible though, I have to be completely transparent about that. I mean, there just isn't a whole lot of decisive tools that you can use here from turn 1. Like, you have a very mediocre skirmish cavalry, which, I mean, light skirmish cavalry is never a decisive tool of war in Total War Rome 2, so I think it's pretty obvious that these guys aren't going to be your battle-winning unit from turn 1. These guys, like, don't let their stats fool you. That 8 melee attack and that 19 melee defense, that's just because of the experience chevron. In reality, this is a pretty bad spear unit. I mean, it's not horrible. Like, this Gallic light spearman is better than a lot of levy units are. However, they're only like marginally better. They're a little step up from your typical like Greek or Persian levy, making them rather uninspiring. Like, you don't really want these guys in abundance in your army. They'll be more of a liability once you have better access to better troops, and of course your opponents have access to better troops. And this is the only infantry that you have from turn 1. You do have access to a very good skirmish unit here, but of course, when it comes to skirmishers, right, they're more of a supportive element in your army, particularly a slinger, which will never just kill very quickly. So ultimately, I'm sure it's not surprising that this unit is once again not that decisive piece that you need to win battles with ease. So collectively, this is a really bad assortment of troops to recruit from for turn 1. And while most of your neighbors won't have anything vastly better, like all of the Gaulic or Celtic factions start out with rather bad recruitment for turn 1, it really doesn't help you that you do too, and it's going to put you on extremely even footing with all of these factions. So frankly, your first maybe 20 turns or so should be rather defensive. Like, all of these factions, from what I've seen, they're going to turtle up near their settlements, they're going to stay in their territories for the most part. And if you go and attack them while within range of their settlements, they'll just beat you because they'll have numbers, they'll have their garrisons, and you just won't have anything capable of turning the tide of battle. Otherwise, because your income is pretty high, you have even less incentive to journey too far away from Nemoses. Just recruit a couple of decent units when they come up, particularly from your mercenary pool. This axe unit is actually very good. Look at that charge bonus of 27, boys. An absolutely incredible charge bonus. 3 speed, making them quite maneuverable, 2 volleys of javelins. They are light, which is a liability, and 10 armor isn't great, although for early game, that's awfully sufficient. I mean, your spear unit only has 8 after all. But 13 armor penetration damage as well as 225 men, it makes this a great shock unit. This isn't the type of unit that you want to leave in battle long term, but this is a very, very good shock unit. And spoiler alert, you don't really have a ton of shock infantry that's easily recruitable in your army as the Arverni. So having a couple of these guys handy is super useful in early game especially, but even going into mid game, these guys still have their use. So get these guys when they're available. You can even journey into foreign territory and grab some too, or you can grab this cavalry. I mean, it has reasonably good combat stats. Yeah, just feast upon the fruit of good mercenaries when you can. Although the cavalry is a little bit expensive, so you might not want to fare. Yeah, I would definitely upgrade this gold settlement. And now let's just look towards your diplomatic standing. Now, oddly enough, you start out with a defensive ally, which is rather rare. That defensive alliance comes with basically everything else you'd expect. Military access, trade agreement, it's the full package. Which typically, that would be pretty handy. I mean, having a defensive ally should in theory enhance your security as a faction, but also, these guys do control the other minor settlements in your territory, in your starting province. So, it's kind of like bittersweet, because while it is nice to have an ally, particularly when there's such parity between you and your neighbors, these guys are also just kind of weak. Like, I wish I could just go in there and take their settlement from them. So that's the thing, because you should naturally covet their lands quite a bit. It is a little bit of a liability when it comes to that alliance. You do also start out at war with the Audi, and these guys absolutely despise you with every fiber of their being. Like, these guys, it doesn't matter how much money you offer them, they will not agree to a peace. They just despise you. But the other thing is that they're also a highly defensive faction, and as long as you have some units defending the settlement, like I'm not talking about just your garrison, but as long as you have like a small little army to support this, you can quite easily send your main army away to try to hunt easier prey. And the thing is that if you go attack Bidlocrats, this settlement will become your death tomb. Like, literally, this faction will just keep a nice 20 stack in this settlement, a nice 10 stack here. You know, their garrison will be massive, a nice 20 stack to just reinforce these armies. It is so hard to take these guys down when they're on the defensive, particularly in early game with the roster that you have. So it's just like, I just don't feel like it's feasible to take these guys out just yet. You know, taking this whole province is basically step 2, but I would just play somewhat defensively around Nemosis and just finish off your own province, you know, break your alliance with these guys eventually, take Burgi, however you pronounce this, but, your provincial capital, take this probably first, break the alliance here, take Lemonium, and once you've unified this province, then go for your long-term enemies here of the Audi. In general, you should make it your goal to just unite most of Gaul before you expand elsewhere. I just feel like it's the thing that makes the most sense, because Gaul is very defensible. Like, outside of Britannia over here is basically no one on the flank of Gaul, so it's just an exceptionally nice province to have, just in terms of defensibility, and of course just in terms of cultural affinity. Like, all of these are Celtic factions, so these Celtic people should be relatively easy to incorporate into your burgeoning empire. So it just makes sense to conquer Gaul. I feel like, don't really imagine any other path you take, specifically because you're just surrounded by other Gauls. You're kind of deep in the center of it. So I think it just makes sense to go conquer the rest of the Gauls. And yeah, that's really all it is when it comes to your early game strategy. Take your province, You know, don't be afraid of breaking this alliance. It won't hurt you too much. And then go take on the Audi and secure the rest of his province. Once you've done that, it's really up to you whether you want to go south and invade Massalia and later Rome. Later you want to, you know, take more territory in the north and just break into Germania, which would make sense. You could even go stage an invasion into Britannia. I mean, after all, once you take Britannia and you secure it, nobody's going to ever take it from you. It's just such a great area to enhance your economy from. So it's really up to you what you want to do, but there's just so many options that make sense once you have Gaul secured. Now let's go look at your factional buffs and debuffs, because some of them are good, but I can tell you that debuff that the Arverni have is really, really bad. Now, the Arverni have a couple of quite interesting buffs and debuffs, but when it comes to all the Celtic factions, I do feel like you have some pretty strong ones. I do feel like you have some really, really, really nice ones. Firstly, but +1 experience for all Gallic cavalry recruits is just so good, because when it comes to the campaign, experience chevrons is how you really get your units to outperform the enemy consistently. Like, the base stats of units, of course, matter, don't get me wrong. However, you can basically make a unit as strong as you want by having sufficient experience chevrons on them, and having experience chevrons on a unit when you first recruit it is like a cheat code almost. It just brings them into the next tier right from the beginning. So having a +1 experience for all Gallic cavalry recruits will just instantly make your cavalry strong. So that's just great. And Gallic cavalry is amazing. It is so good for how much you pay for it. It's just insanely cost effective. It's not the most powerful cavalry in the game, but they're skilled, fast, and pretty cheap for what you get. So big thumbs up on this. Increased population for temples when your culture is dominant is also really, really good, because the temples are going to help you get your culture there. And of course, having your population expanding constantly is the key to having a very taxable economy. So just collectively, like, these two are some very strong buffs. Big thumbs up. The Gauls aren't the most powerful factions militarily, but these buffs definitely help them compete. Now, when it comes to the Arverni specifically, you have increased income from metal resources, which, obviously that's pretty strong, considering that you start out with gold. So any gold you find, any silver you find, any bronze you find will be immensely useful. If you didn't start with gold, I don't feel like this would be that useful, but considering what you do, it is powerful. You have to admit it's powerful. So this is pretty good. Also, to be fair, barbarian economies do tend to struggle a little bit compared to their Hellenic and Eastern adversaries, so having a nice little buff helps you compete a little bit too. Now this one, the ability to form client states. I don't really find this particularly useful. Client states, their loyalty is capricious at best. They're just not particularly great. Satraps are far superior to client states in my mind, so I wouldn't really say that this is a superior buff. I feel like this is somewhat not useful, but at least the option's there. As far as I'm aware, the other Celtic factions cannot form client states, so having the ability to, like, it is useful if you don't want to overextend yourself, yet you want to eliminate a faction. Like, say they're on your border, they're harassing you, you know, you go into their territory, you conquer them, but you don't want to hold them. You just know you're not going to conquer that province, or you don't want to share a border with a particular faction. It is useful in that situation to form a client, so it's okay, but I don't know. It just doesn't feel like a luxury as a person that plays like Greek factions and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to your debuff, public order penalty from Celtic cultures is terrible, man. That is so bad, because you're a Celtic faction. And one of your buffs relies on, you know, making temples, which will hurt people, the Celts, which creates a chain reaction that increases the public order penalty. Now, to be fair, your public order penalty from foreign cultures will always be higher than the one that you receive from Celtic cultures. So it's not that bad. Like, if you have a province with like 100% Celtic culture or whatever, the debuff's only going to be like a -3 public order or a -4 public order. So this is highly manageable, but it's just so annoying to always have a cultural disorder debuff. It's so annoying to constantly have it, but it is what it is. It is manageable. Every faction has a debuff. It is usually a pretty harsh one, considering that you get 4 buffs, so you know, you can live with it. It isn't the end of the world. But now, boys, let's go look at the Arverni roster and see how they compete to the rest of the ancient world. Now, this is the first barbarian faction I'm reviewing outside of the Balkan factions, which is, they have a place in my heart. I love my Adricians, my Dacians, and my RDA, of course, the little brother of Balkan factions. So I didn't have a whole lot of familiarity with Celtic factions before making this guide, but I looked at all of the rosters, kind of took notes to compare the different units, you know, understand which factions are better at what type of unit, and what you can generally expect from Celtic factions. And really, what you can expect from most of them is horrible archers. Like, literally the only Celtic faction that has a serviceable archer are the Bowie Eyes. So in terms of skirmishers, you're basically just locked to slingers and javelin throwing skirmishers. The javelin throwing skirmishers typically are pretty competent in melee, at least besides maybe like whatever generic youth one you have at the bottom. So, you know, expect high charge, low armor, javelin throwing skirmishers, as well as competent slingers. Slingers as Celtic factions are all really good. Like, there isn't a single horrible slinger amongst any of the Celtic factions, so expect that. Expect few cavalry options, but very good cavalry options, very cost-effective and combat-effective cavalry. You usually will have at least one phalanx in your army with a Celtic, like a Gaulic or a Britannic faction. However, most of these factions don't have a ton of phalanx options. Usually they have like one or two, either a low tier or like a noble to pick from. But as the Arverni, you get both nobles and commoners as phalanxes, and you get a late and early game variant. So you have like by far the best selection of phalanxes, and you have some of the strongest ones. There's very few that can compete against yours. Most of them are far weaker, so generally have good phalanxes as the Arverni. In terms of spears, you really do get a varied bunch. Like, a lot of Celtic factions, they kind of have like a naked spear, like a charged spear type. Some of them, of course, have noble spears. Some of them have light spears, medium spears. I mean, in general, the spear variation, you know, it's what you kind of expect from any faction. You can have strong noble spears, you can have bad levies, you can have mid-tier spears, which are serviceable, but not elite units by any means, not decisive game-winning units. In general, the majority of your units in Celtic factions will kind of be like similar to Freo spears, if I have to be honest. And then in melee infantry, you generally have really solid, cost-effective options across the board. But with the Arverni, you have a particularly strong late-game sword, which we'll get into very soon. But first, as per tradition, let's go and do the generals. Now, for the Arverni generals, you have these four options. Now, one of them is your Gallic heavy spearman, and statistically I would never advise that you bring this unit. It is essentially a Freo spear. I think the only thing that this one does better than a Freo spear is charge bonus. Let's just quickly whip out your generic Freo spear, and yeah, that's pretty much it. 1 charge bonus and 2 weapon damage additionally. And of course, you know, it does have better stats. It does have better combat stats. I can't ignore that, okay? It says better, but still, it's a general unit. It's marginally better than a Freo spear, and it's a general unit. Think about that. Is a Freo spear really the type of unit that you want to put your general into? Like, a Freo spear is generally considered an incredibly mid-tier unit. Just a placeholder that's better than the average crap unit, but not amazing. And this is only a little bit better. Truthfully, this unit only serves a purpose as a very cheap general. If for whatever reason you're just trying to recruit the cheapest army possible, of course you put this in, but in terms of how effective this will be in combat, it just won't be very good. It's just not a very good unit to put as a general. Simple as that. Also, this is called the Gallic Heavy Spearman, however, it's also a medium spear, so keep that in mind. It is truly very Freo Spear-like. Now, your Gallic champions, this is a very, very cool unit. Because 17 melee attack, 28 charge, and 32 weapon damage is crazy. This unit is offensively exceptionally viable. However, this unit needs to be used as a shock unit. I've tested these guys out against generic Roman legionaries. We're talking about like Marian legionaries or Principe, like that level of unit. And this unit will lose in prolonged melee, as they should, as was historically recorded on several occasions. Even the Gaulic nobles could not compete against the immense grinding capacity of Roman infantry. So ultimately, these guys aren't really like a mainline unit at all. They will struggle if there's too much pressure put on these guys. However, they are exceptionally strong on the flanks. If you give these guys proper spear support, and these guys can just wrap around and rear charge a unit, it's game over. For that 28 charge bonus, 32 weapon damage, and 17 melee attack is like a Drisian Romthia warrior like. Now, the sole weakness of this unit, of course, is 10 armor. 10 armor is pretty damn bad. So they're squishy. They can get shot to death. They can get charged by cavalry to death. They can get grinded down to death. They definitely have weaknesses, but ultimately, if you use these guys as a shock infantry unit, they will serve you exceptionally well. They come from your first class, though. Now, when it comes to your elite Gallic cavalry general, you just have a class across the board. Across the board, these two options, both your late game variant and your early game variant, are really, really good. And when you look at these statistics, you just see, like, essentially, you just see the very best stats that you could expect for like a melee cavalry style unit. It's just so good. These guys will obliterate the vast majority of cavalry in a prolonged melee, while simultaneously they have 50 charge bonus, making them competent as a shock cavalry, as a rear charge cavalry, as a hammer and anvil, which will work well with your phalanxes. Of these generals, like, unless you're just extremely dead set on trying to buff your infantry with the presence of Gallic champions, I would just pick this cavalry. Like, 9 out of 10 times, I'd be rolling with the cavalry. It's safer. This cavalry is exceptionally good, so they're really, as a high utility unit. And it's like, this unit has low armor, so you don't want your general in such a squishy unit. And this unit's just not very good, and you don't want your general in a bad unit. So it only makes sense to bring these guys. Now, the other thing is you actually cannot recruit these Royal Cavalry units regularly. They're general only, and they're better than your regular cavalry options, which, while good, aren't anywhere close to as good. So you also want these guys because they will help support your cavalry and just make your cavalry squadron much better. Now, moving on to your melee infantry, you start out with your Gallic clubmen, exceptionally cheap unit. Of course, you can't recruit them on turn 1, which is really funny to me, considering that this is like such a primitive tool. But this is basically a funky levy. Funky in the sense that a lot of levies, their main role is to like hold but not kill very much. That's like the main role that like a spearbound levy uses. But a Gallic levy, a Gallic clubman levy, what these guys do essentially is that they could charge the rear and do quite a bit of damage, but if they ever get charged frontally, they die instantaneously. 1 armor is pathetic, 5 and 6 melee attack and defense is horrible. These guys have no resiliency, but they can penetrate through armor, and they can charge pretty well with a charge bonus of 18, which is equivalent to Roman legionaries, so they can charge pretty rapidly. But ultimately, like, unless you're just really, like, scrounging money and you need some, like, striking power, some breaking for the enemy power, there's no reason to use these guys. They are so shit otherwise. So I just wouldn't bring them. Now, moving on, your Gallic Axeman is an absolutely decent unit. An absolutely decent unit. Now, this is an actual unit that you can consistently use to break through your foes, just like those mercenary axemen I was talking about. These guys have a great charge bonus and amazing armor penetration. For weapon damage, just suffer compared to swordsmen. Axemen do less, but that's because they penetrate through armor. Of course, you do have to be a little bit careful because a lot of Celtic units don't have a lot of armor. And if you charge a high armor penetrating unit into a unit that doesn't have a lot of armor, it kind of negates the combat effectiveness of something like a Gallic Axeman. But truthfully, this unit in general is really good. Don't use these guys as a main line. Use these guys behind your main line or on the flanks to commit to like flank charges, into the rear of troops. But ultimately, these guys are just a great shock element to add to your army. Highly advised that you use 1 or 2 of these in an army unless you have better shock options. Your early Gallic Oathsworn, you do have to upgrade your barrack to to get these guys. I believe that they're available from like turn 1. You just have to wait and upgrade your barrack a little bit. They come from your first population class though, so you know you're a little bit constrained in your ability to get these guys, but they're just really, really good. A really, really solid early game unit. Comparable to Roman infantry. Truthfully, I've tested it. These guys are really, really good. Okay, these guys aren't going to be like an Imperial Legionary, but against like Republican infantry, they can absolutely go toe-to-toe and be quite competent. 30 armor, really, really good armor in early game, particularly for a barbaric faction. 19 charge bonus is nothing to scoff at either. That's pretty good for a sword unit. But what these guys are really good at is weapon damage. 28 weapon damage means that they strike with terror. They strike with a passion. They do so much damage in prolonged combat. And that's the thing. You know, when you think of Gauls, you think of big burly guys that get in your face, but these guys are more of a stay in combat for a long time and grind your opponent out type of swordsman. You don't expect these guys to just kill mercilessly right away like a Thracian would. You know, like these guys take their time and they beat your opponents with immense skill. But they don't risk their lives stupidly either. So know that, like, these guys, they kill faster than Romans, but not by much. Not by a ton. You know, you use them similarly to Romans. You know, that's how they're used practically in battle. You know, they're kind of midway between what you expect is like a shock barbarian infantry and Roman, but their application is more like a Roman, I would say. Now, your Gaulic champions are the opposite. I've already covered. This is like your elite shock option. If you have, you know, nobles handy and money handy, you would go for these guys instead of your axes. For these guys in general are just a lot better to bring. Because they're not reliant on armor penetrating damage to get their combat effectiveness, these guys will kill no matter what they charge into. Sure, they don't have as much armor, but they have more morale, so, you know. It's not like we're going to rout particularly quickly, even if they do start taking losses. But it's just their combat stats are insane. 32 weapon damage is absurd, and 28 charge bonus is crazy too. It's just, these guys are so freaking good. Like, if we're gonna have 2 of these on the flanks, I'd recommend just having, like, 1 of these in the back of your army just to, like, push into battle as, like, an X factor. You know, keep these guys safe from, you know, volleys of skirmishers. You don't want them engaging right away, they're just too vulnerable for that. But, like, late in a battle, these guys will absolutely annihilate. They will be such an X factor, such a great unit to have. Now, once you get to turn 90, because late game for the Celts starts at turn 90, you don't have to wait as long as the Greeks, which I think makes sense, because in general, your armies are weaker, in my opinion. This is the way to compensate. But you have your late Gallic Oathsworn. These guys are great. These guys are absolutely amazing. I've tried them out against Roman Praetorians, and they did really, really well. Against kind of the earlier Praetorians, we'll actually beat them decisively, like against, you know, the Camillan ones and the Republican ones. They'll absolutely beat them. I haven't tried them against like Imperial ones. I think that they'll probably lose, but the fact that they beat other Praetorians says a lot. Like, these guys are an absolutely solid unit, and now that they have 21 charge bonus and 30 weapon damage, they definitely pack a lot more punch on the charge than these guys did. But definitely still more of a grindy unit. And with 38 armor, you should probably expect that, right? But absolutely great unit. 30 weapon damage is absolutely crazy. Such a competent sword unit. A beautiful sword unit. And amongst all of the Celtic factions, there is pretty much nothing that will match it. The Scordisi ones might, but they're just more of like a shock sword. But of all the other ones that I checked, they'll either have slightly worse combat stats or less armor. Generally, it's the less armor part. They all kind of have similar combat stats, but yeah, this is just a tank of a unit. Beautiful. Better than the vast majority. This is just elite by Celtic standards. Now, when it comes to your spears, I've already outlined these. Gallic light spearmen are basically just an above average levy unit. That's all that they are. Sure, yes, we do have a combat stats of Freyo spears, which again, that makes them above average. Most levies are worse than Freyo spears in terms of combat, but that bad morale and the bad armor will hold these guys back from being useful, as well as no javelins. It's kind of bad. They're Gallic naked spearmen. These guys do take a little bit of time to get, but they are so good. They're so good. They're really, really good units. Look at that charge bonus of 29. Look at that weapon damage of 25. Look at that bonus for cavalry. Sure, yes, they have 1 armor, but they have 3 volleys of javelins, and they're cheap. That's the main thing, they're cheap. They are similar to Getic Falxmen, in my opinion. Like, these guys just have so much application. They can skirmish. They can charge to rear. They can do immense damage to virtually anything that they're in combat with the combat stats that they have. But because of their armor, don't use these guys as the main line. Don't even use them in the front line of your flank. Keep these guys back. You know, you need to keep them safe. These guys are exceptionally vulnerable. But if you can keep them out of trouble and then throw them into combat when opportune, they will win you the battle. They're just such a good unit for the price. But again, highly volatile unit to use. If you use a lot of them in your army, prepare for trouble, for these guys get into trouble. Now, your Gallic veteran freemen, you get them pretty early on in the campaign. You just need to upgrade your melee barrack once, and these guys are a tier 3 unit. They come from your regular, commoner population. They're honestly really good for like an early game unit that comes through commoner population. If you're not super expensive to maintain, they're not cheap either. I think it'll cost you somewhere between 150 and 170 depending on which general you're using, but still, 8 melee attack, 19 melee defense. I mean, when you look at all of these combat stats, it's similar to like an elite hoplite, guys. This is a really, really competent unit in melee. And yes, of course, they don't have great armor. That's their limitation. But they do have 225 men and are a medium spear infantry. So it's just such a good unit to come from your third population class. By late game, it'll be outdated. That armor is always going to hold them back. But in early game, just such a trump card. Like, that's why I said it might be worth it to bide your time in early game. Once you upgrade that, like, barrack to level 2, you can get these guys. You can get these guys as your main line, and they will outperform every Celtic spear line you go up against if they just jumped the gun and recruited these guys. These dudes are just so much better. Now, you'll also get these Gallic heavy spearmen at the same time, but they come from your second class, and they only have 5 more armor. Otherwise, their stats are identical, and keep in mind that these Gallic veteran freemen have a volley of javelins. These guys don't. So is that 5 armor really worth a volley of javelins? I don't think so. I'm not saying that the volley of javelins worth more, although it can be pretty useful, especially with 225 men. It means more javelins in total are being thrown, but it's more like, if they're the same value, then why would you waste your better population? I don't see the reason to. Now, these guys do have a defensive formation, but to be honest with you, I don't find the Celtic defensive formation to be useful all that much. It is worse than a phalanx, like, objectively. Your guys move really slow, and you lower attack, so I just don't think it's great. But in any case, it is what it is. Now, for your phalanxes, as I mentioned, you do have pretty dang solid Celtic phalanxes for this faction. Now, the way that Celtic phalanxes work is that they're worse in phalanx formation than Greek hoplites, as they should be. They should be. It's Greek hoplites that had the phenomenal combat record, not the Celtic ones as much. But out of combat, they're marginally better. That's where we kind of preserve their strength. But you can see even this early Gallic shield wall spearmen, I mean, they have 8 melee attack and 19 melee defense. A Greek hoplite would have 7 melee attack and 15 melee defense. Not really that good. Not really that good. Greek hoplite would have more armor, which is what you'd expect. You'd expect a Celt to be less armored. But that's really the difference here. Of course, yeah, the shield wall is just not as good. You lose some attack, you lose some speed. I believe that a hoplite phalanx doesn't do anything like that, I mean. It does say attack is reduced, but I didn't find out. Whenever I use a hoplite phalanx, it doesn't feel like attack is reduced. But it's just when you use this formation, you will realize it yourself. Like, it's just underwhelming. It's not nearly as intuitive, not nearly as responsive as a hoplite phalanx. Like, a phalanx is like a dynamic instrument that can move around in the battlefield, like a twist and swerve that can maneuver. Shield Wall doesn't do that. And, you know, I used these guys extensively during my Gete campaign. I mean, the Gete, they have Shield Wall, but are pretty similar to the ones that you have here. Pretty similar. I think maybe a little bit less combat effective, but pretty similar. Pretty similar. You know what? Let me just check here. No, actually better. Actually better. At least, like, better than the commoner one that you have. Just in terms of armor. Slightly better. Not significantly better, but slightly better. But anyway, when you use this formation, you basically can't move the unit all that effectively, but you can with phalanxes, so that's like the main difference. But in any case, guys, these guys do have good combat stats. Like, these guys are a very, very, very stable unit to have. Absolutely worth it to have as your main line, but keep in mind that you can recruit a unit like this from your third population class. These guys, they come from your second population class, and these guys come from your first population class. So, while I would argue that the Phalanx is a more stable and consistent unit than these types of spear infantry that will die quicker, that will be a little less hardy. It's just, at the end of the day, these guys are harder to maintain. So, pick which type of unit you want as your main line. Of course, when it comes to swordsmen, you know, I don't really expect you to have the resources or recruitment ability to actually get these Oathsworn in large numbers until more into like the mid to late game. And the rest of these swords, from your Gallic champions to your axemen, they're just not mainline materials. So it's gonna have to be your spears. So yeah, pick wisely. By the way, this late Gallic Noble Shield Wall, like outside of the score DC Pike Shield Wall, this is the best Gallic Phalanx. The best Celtic Phalanx. Better than the Britannic Nobles, better than everything. These guys are beasts. 48 armor. That's how much elite Greek hoplites have. Yet it has better combat stats than Greek hoplites. It has one more melee defense. Again, you're not going to have hoplite phalanx. You still have the stupid shield wall, but it's just such a solid mainline to have. Like, a solid spear mainline to have. But of course, at this point in the game, you're going to be able to recruit late Gallic Oathsworn. And to be honest, you're trolling if you get these guys over Oathsworn. You're absolutely trolling. Get the Oathsworn! They come from the same population class, so you have no excuse. This is just such a more competitive unit. Like, I'm comparing these guys to, like, elite, you know, Greek hoplites, you know. The most powerful unit that Rhodes have, yippee. But, like, this is as good as a Praetorian. So, obviously, this is way better. So, yeah, maybe not. But for early game, you can absolutely use some Gallic nobles. You can absolutely use some shield wall spearmen. Late game, if you want a cost-effective, cost-effective line, you can use these late Gallic shield wall spearmen. That's what I did in my Geta campaign a couple of times. But let's move on, boys. When it comes to your missile infantry, you do have one archer. Never ever use this archer unit. It's so bad, dude. Range of 155 as well as missile damage of 14. This is just worse than every generic archer for like other cultures. Just Gallic archers are horrendous. I don't understand why they're so bad. I guess their bow technology was behind or something. I don't know what the lore is, but apparently they're highly skilled with their bows. Press X for doubt. This is just a terrible, terrible bow unit. Don't use them. Now, your Gallic skirmishers, these guys are not great. I mean, a skirmisher can always do damage. If you land javelins, they kill, but ultimately, 80 range and 20 missile damage is not particularly good skirmish statistics. Your combat stats are quite bad. Sure, you do have a charge bonus, so if these guys hit a flank, they'll do some damage, but ultimately, their low melee attack and melee defense will ensure that they perform quite mediocrely. They do have some armor penetration because they come in with axes, though, so I'm not going to say these guys are going to kill nothing. They have the potential to kill a decent amount and can be pretty cost-effective with the right rear charges and just, you know, ultimately nothing attacks these guys and they're just exploiting, you know, turned enemy back, so they can definitely do some damage. Now, this heavy Gallic skirmisher, these guys are more of a top shelf. More of the top shelf. I don't believe you need reforms to get these guys. You just need money. You know, but they're just a decent skirmisher, okay? 85 range and 21 missile damage is absolutely nothing amazing, but their combat stats are genuinely pretty impressive. Like 11 melee attack and 9 melee defense, that's good. You know, that is comparable to a lot of early to mid-tier, to mid-game infantry units. And having 18 charge bonus and 26 weapon damage means that they can also be effective on the charge while simultaneously not being as easily killed as these Gallic skirmishers. So these guys are pretty good as a fighting skirmisher. You know, if you're looking for like the best javelin thrower, this isn't it. But if you're looking for a skirmisher that can then go into combat and have some effectiveness, really bolster, you know, some of the ragtag elements of your melee component, then use these guys for sure. They can definitely do that. Your best skirmisher when it comes to Arverni is definitely the Arverni Spear. I mean, this unit essentially has the same, I mean, slightly lower, but very similar combat statistics to an early Greek Peltis, which is crazy for a spear unit. Simultaneously, a slinger unit. And simultaneously, these guys have spears, so they're going to be also good against cavalry. They have 8 armor, considering that most slingers don't have a single bit of armor on them. That's actually pretty good. And they do have good missile damage at 11 and range of 190, but ultimately, that isn't anything special for a Celtic slinger. All Celtic slingers have those slinging stats. It just, of all the Celtic slingers, this is by far the best one for melee combat. And these melee stats are honestly pretty good. Pretty comparable to this unit, if I'm going to be completely honest. Like, this unit's better, but this unit's pretty similar, while being a much, much, much better skirmisher. So use this Gallic Slinger Spearman in abundance. It's one of your main tools as the Arverni. It's not a decisive tool that's going to win battles like an Oathsworn or, you know, like a Gallic Champion or whatever, but ultimately this is just a bit of nice utility, a nice supportive element for your army. Slinger that can join the main line. It's a pretty novel thing. Now, moving on to your cavalry, you just don't have a lot of options, but Gallic cavalry is quite excellent. Because Gallic early medium cavalry essentially plays the role that, like, how do I put this? Like a citizen cavalry would, but it's more offensively capable than a citizen cavalry. It has slightly higher charge, I think slightly better weapon damage. It has more melee attack and more melee defense, and it moves faster, but it does have lower armor by like 10, which is significantly less, but ultimately I would take this armor, I would take this cavalry over a citizen cavalry any day of the week. This one's just going to have a lot more potential to do decisive damage. It's also cheaper. It's actually a relatively cheap unit to maintain, so ultimately this is a pretty strong unit, but of course it's not like an amazing unit. It's not like a companion cavalry or anything like that, or a noble cavalry. This one's just like okay. It will get beat by plenty, but it's just a solid unit to have. And there's really nothing else to say about it. It's kind of like a tribal cavalry unit that will do its job, but you know, definitely can't compete with the more wealthy nobles of wealthier civilizations. But by a late game, your empire would have grown to the size where you can imitate their armor, imitate the quality of their horsemen, while simultaneously being significantly more warlike, as you are a Gaul, as you are a Celt. You have the heart of a warrior. Now, ultimately, this is just an amazing, just absolutely phenomenal chef's kiss unit. No Greek cavalry unit will have the combat stats of these guys. Like 12 and 18 is crazy, while also sporting really good weapon damage and a solid charge. This is just a beast. This is just a tank. Although maybe I should say that, because, you know, if you're going up against like a super heavy cavalry like a cataphract, you'll probably still lose with a unit like this. But against any heavy cavalry, these guys will just win in prolonged melee. They're just insane. Absolutely absurd stats. Now, the weakness of his cavalry roster is that you don't have any truly shock cavalry, but these guys are just such competent warriors that you will find a lot of use for them. And they're just flexible since they still maintain really high speed of 7. Just a great unit. Now, I wouldn't really recommend picking this missile cav, just like every low-tier missile cavalry in the game. They're there if you want like the cheapest cavalry to recruit. But this isn't a particularly great unit. Now, I do think that the combat stats of this unit is better than like the Greek variation, but Just because you're a little bit better than someone that's terrible doesn't mean that you're good. I don't really have anything to say about this unit. It is just like a very, very generic missile cavalry. Bring him if you want missile cavalry, but I wouldn't bring him in general. And that's really your roster. I mean, you have some tools here. Great late game swords, some nice shock infantry to use throughout your early and mid game. A nice, really cost-effective but easy to recruit, like mainline spearmen. Consider these like the Freo spears of the Gauls. You have really good phalanx selection for a Celtic faction at least, and a nice slinger, a good naked spear too, a really interesting and pretty cost-effective shock unit. But when I really put this roster together, I realized that this is a really motley set of tools. This truly is a ragtag set of tools that doesn't quite fit together. However, collectively, that you have the capacity to really beat any faction just if you employ your tools correctly. But ultimately, just this army is not logically assembled. It's not like a good Greek faction, but amongst the Celtic rosters, the Arverni are definitely one of the better rosters out there. So I think that when it comes to the power rating of this faction, and I'm rating these guys objectively, against the entire roster of Rome 2. So this isn't just against other Gauls, which I think the Arverni stack up great against other Gauls. But just as a faction in Rome 2, I would say that they're just okay. I would say that they're maybe a 6.5 out of 10. They're better than average, but not by much. Just there isn't amazing synergy within this roster. Limited cavalry options hurts them. Limited slinger options hurts them, and they really only have one great option. The phalanxes just aren't amazing. I wouldn't really say barbarian phalanxes are really the way to go. And, when it comes to melee infantry, it's really only the Oathsworn that are giving me, exceptionally strong infantry energy. The rest of the units, they're good to use, but they're not going to be the most easy to use. You have a lot of low armor units that you're going to have to be cautious when using. Now, when it comes to how much you need to play the Arverni campaign, it really just depends on how much you like Gauls. When you start out in the middle of Gaul, and it's really nothing exceptionally unique about their start position or their just general destiny as a faction, I would say. I really feel like for just an average faction in Rome 2, it's kind of like a 5 out of 10. You don't really need to play them, but if you're going to play a Celtic faction, I guess it's kind of cool. If you really want to role play as a we can say just a run-of-the-mill Celtic chieftain that's trying to achieve greatness, unify the tribes, and then, find foreign powers to conquer and plunder, then Arverni will give you that vibe. So that's a good 5 out of 10 when it comes to that. When it comes to how hard this campaign is, I wouldn't really say that it's all too difficult. It's just a matter of being smart, not overextending, just basic Total War stuff. You don't want to declare wars endlessly and ceaselessly without considering the diplomatic repercussions of them. You don't want to leave your settlements unguarded when you have enemies at your doorstep. But there just isn't really all that much danger when it comes to this faction. At least not anywhere close to the beginning of the campaign. Maybe once the Swebi arrive on the scene, but that'll take a really long time. So ultimately, I would say in terms of difficulty, again, just average. Because you're not a super strong faction at the beginning, I can't say that this is an easy campaign by any means, but nor do I think that this is a really hard campaign. So, it's a good 5 out of 10. The Arverni really do epitomize average in so many regards, which makes them a good start, I think, to both my Gaulic faction reviews as well as you if you want to play a Celtic campaign. Why would you want to start with something exceptional? Start with the average and then deviate outwards from that. But anyway, that's all I really have to say about the Arverni. I hope that you liked the guide, and if you do, subscribe to my channel please and like the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.